Hey everyone, guess we're back for the yearly Worlds edition of Losing to the Shopkeeper. Usually, I go over a variety of potential questionable builds in professional matches and look into whether they were actually suboptimal or not. Today's episode is going to focus heavily on Grievous wounds and Orb, as that has been a prevalent point of discussion so far. Now, before we start, I'd like to preface this by saying that currently, Grievous wounds items are not tracking the amount of health regen that is reduced. This makes things fairly harder to look into, and honestly quite annoying too because of the passives like Second Wind or Doran's Shield. I do hope that eventually the items track both health regen cut and healing cut in separate sections, as it would make it easier to look at the value of its passive. So, let's start with example number 1. In game 1 of EG vs Mad, JojoPyun rushed Oblivion Orb against Niski's Silas. So let's contextualize the buy. At level 3, JojoPyun takes a really bad trade with Niski, who hits level 4 first. Jojo recalls with exactly 800 gold. At 800 gold, his buys are quite limited. Ideally, you'd like to back at 1300 for Lost Chapter, but that's not the case here. So aside from the Oblivion Orb buy, his other options include Amp Tome plus Sapphire Crystal, or Amp Tome plus Dark Seal. The first option means he's closest to his Mythic, but sacrifices immediate power. The second gives him the same ability power as Oblivion Orb, with the potential upside of gaining Dark Seal stacks and also having an item that builds into his Mythic. In theory, the Oblivion Orb option looks logical. Silas has Doran's Shield and Second Wind, so you can limit his health regen, and you can also cut down the ceiling from his W when he trades with you. Now, the numbers of the healing reduction looked quite pitiful early on, having reduced 0 healing by the 20-minute mark, 354 by the 30-minute mark, but 1109 by the end of the match at almost 38 minutes. And at this point, a couple of users on Reddit and Twitter justify this as, well, the Oblivion Orb buy changes how Niski plays the matchup, so he's discouraged from trading. Is that true? Well, I looked into other professional Silas vs Victor matches, unfortunately not many in the top regions recently. I looked at AL vs TT, KT vs Nongshim, Bro vs HLE. All Silases played basically at range from Victor, spamming Q to poke and clear the waves to avoid direct trades. Most either maxed Q or 0.3 early points in it. Niski himself also played this matchup versus Larson in the LEC playoffs, where he went 3 points Q into W max. Jojo also played the other side of this matchup against Humanoid, where he just maxed Q. I also talked to high elo Victor player Dunn, who told me that Silas has started maxing Q more recently, so the value from an Oblivion Orb rush isn't great. Delaying Lost Chapter and your Mythic item also feels pretty bad overall. Getting it later on is fine though, as it makes it easier to sidelane versus Silas. So, did the purchase discourage or change how Niski plays? I cannot say for certain without asking the player. What I can note is that he did go for a third point in W, which was quite surprising. 2 early points in W before Qmax is common, and he also leveled mid-trade, so the second point in W was likely for that. But Niski's ability order in this game was 2 points W into 2 points Q into a third point in W into Qmax. However, regardless of skill order, if you watch the lane, you'll see he played it quite similarly to the other matches I mentioned, playing at max range, just poking with Q. In addition, I have seen some quite unique skill orders from Niski on Silas and solo queue, such as not maxing out any ability until later on, so I wouldn't put much thought into this. So, was it a good buy? I'd say it wasn't. If you want it later to limit Silas's effective healing in fights, I think it's fine, but early it doesn't seem great. Delaying Lost Chapter is really rough on Victor. Without it, he didn't have the mana to shove waves, which meant Niski could freeze, which then means that Jojo needs to call his jungler or support to help with presence so he can get his wave to bounce. Now naturally, the problem comes from earlier in the game, with a bad trade that led him to not being able to get the ideal recall. But I think the other two options would have been better, as they don't compromise Victor's Mythic timing so much. Ironically enough, this match, Mad really needed Grievous wounds, playing against Aatrox and Maokai. Next, we have Faker versus Scout in the Akali versus Azir matchup. In this match, Scout recalled it for a minute to buy an early Oblivion Orb. Once again, healing reduction numbers don't look great early on, which is somewhat to be expected as Akali doesn't have innate healing in her kit. However, this was bought with the sole purpose of cutting down Akali's regen, using Azir's higher range to constantly poke down the Akali through Doran's Shield and Second Wind. Unfortunately, and as I mentioned before, the item tooltip isn't tracking health regen. So instead, I loaded up the replay, chose a part of the game, and manually tracked Akali's health regen at half-second intervals, noting down whether Faker was affected by Grievous wounds and how much he would have healed if he wasn't. The result is that over an 80-ish second window, Scout reduced around 91 health regen from Faker. If you ask me, that seems like a decent amount of health regen reduced in the early game. We're talking pre-level 6, but I will note that this is a very extreme case. Faker potted in this window, and was also playing really on the limit because his goal was to back with enough gold to get Sork Shoes and a refillable potion. So then the question becomes, if you cannot punish Akali enough by cutting her health regen in this small window of time, is the buy really worth it, as it means you're delaying your mythic completion? I personally side with no, but I think there's enough nuance here to merit a discussion. So for JoJo's case, I think the buy wasn't the greatest. I can understand the angle better in this game, where Azir is not as mana-starved as Victor, so not having Lost Chapter isn't as punishing. Buying Orb this early can potentially net you an advantage, but the downsides are many. For some champions, delaying Lost Chapter or their Mythic is quite impactful, even if Mythic components and Orb do slightly more damage than the completed Mythic. Let's not forget the Mythic items also have actives and passives such as Rocket Belt's Dash or Luden's Proc, and the game is also not an isolated 1v1. I definitely don't think that Grievous wounds are useless, but personally I think it should rarely be built this early and should only come in later in one's build. Lastly, I'd like to mention Morellonomicon itself, the completed item. I don't need to say much because Freak actually summarized it perfectly for me.
It is 2,500 gold for 300 health and 90 ability power. It is a really good stat stick that happens to have Grievous wounds on it.
So yeah, unlike the old Morellonomicon, which wasn't great to complete, the new one is actually a pretty decent stat stick, even ignoring the passive, just like Chainsword. Completing them also contributes to the Mythic passive, which can be plus 15 AP from Everfrost or extra magic penetration from Luden's. It's not a terrific item, and it's not as strong of a bridge item as say Shadow Flame, but if you're on limited income, I think it's fine. Bonus points if you're also building it with the intention of reducing keylink on top of purchasing a cheap stat stick. This is also why Chainsword was so popular some patches ago. The item gave great stats for 2,600 gold, which is why you saw every jungler rush it. Now that it's 2,800 gold, it's less attractive, and that leads me to my next point. In T1 versus EDG, JJ on Vi rushed the Chainsword, a very common item build path in Vi's and pro play. Reason for this being that you usually want some damage early before moving into tank items, but the Bruiser mythics are expensive, and with Chainsword you get your offensive purchase before going into your tank mythic. You also don't want to rush a tank mythic on Vi because you don't really need Bomby Cinder to help you clear. So two things. Number one, now that the item is more expensive, consider going for Black Cleaver instead. At just 300 more gold, you do get less AD, but more health and an armor shred and movement speed passive. Number two, if you are going to build Chainsword, don't build Executioners first. For less gold, 2 longswords give you the same AD, you can build into Caulfields instead. The Executioner's Calling should be the last component you buy when building this as your first item. Anyways, that's going to be it for this episode of Losing to the Shopkeeper. There's definitely more stuff going on with crown purchases and even other builds, but I wanted to get this out of the way. Especially now in the break between groups. I hope you guys enjoy this. Editing was very crude and very basic because I'm currently in the process of traveling to New York to go watch Worlds. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully will be sooner rather than later.